speaking to you on the subject of the last days, or more explicitly, we're examining the usage of this phrase, this terminology in the Bible. What does the Bible mean when it uses the expression, the last days? Now, most people think they know what it means. We think that it means the last days of planet Earth, and most people, if you were to take a poll today, I think you would find most people say, yes, today we are living in the last days. It's not because anyone today has any kind of special revelation, or because anyone today has really given any serious thought to it. It's just that we hear that on all sides. We hear it on television, from secular programs like the History Channel. We hear it from preachers almost universally. We hear it almost everywhere. So it's a sort of a foregone conclusion. People assume that we are living in the last days. Now, our question for our purposes today is, what is the Bible saying? What does the Bible mean when it uses that expression, the last days? Let me read you 3 verses that I've been reading in these messages, and then we'll comment on these. Hebrews chapter 1. Verse 1 says this, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spoke in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. Acts chapter 2, verse 16, on the day of Pentecost, Peter said, But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, Little children, it is the last time. And as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know it is the last time. Now, I would only call to your attention the self-evident and obvious fact that these verses which are written in the Bible were not written in our day, were not written in recent times. These were written nearly 2,000 years ago. Each of these writers, in the book of Acts, quoting Peter speaking, he said, this is that spoken by the prophet Joel, that in the last days. And John, in his first epistle, said, my little children, we know that it is the last time. And the writer to the Hebrews, many people assume to be Paul, but we're not for sure about that, said, God spoke to us in times past, spoke to the fathers by the prophets, but in these last days has spoken unto us by the Son. So it's clear and evident that the Bible writers and the Bible people that were writing the New Testament considered the time in which they lived to be the last days. Now, both things cannot be true. We cannot be living in the last days, and the Bible writers living in the last days. Both things, those are incompatible. So either they're right and we're wrong, or we're right and they're wrong. I would prefer to say that the Bible writers are correct and we are mistaken when we think that we are living in the last days. Now that is the first hurdle that you've got to get over. You can't really proceed and understand any further what the Bible is talking about unless you can cleanse your mind of that preconceived notion that we today are living in the last days. Now, many of you that are watching will not be able to clear that hurdle because you've heard it so many times and you're so sure that we're living in the last days. But all I can ask you to do is to have an open mind enough to just consider the possibility. What if we today are not living in the last days? And what if the Bible writers, as they said, we're living in the last days? Well, that raises some questions. First of all, we assume that when we read the words last days, that means last days of planet Earth. But that's not necessarily what it means. Well, is there anything that we can look at and point to that's significant enough that was in the lifetime of the writers of the Bible that they could call the days in which they were living the last days? Well, in order to answer that question, let's use another phrase that's linked to this, that is the end of the world. Here's my favorite end of the world verse. It's in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26. Speaking of Jesus and talking about how his sacrifice is superior to the sacrifices of the Old Testament. It says, Hebrews 9:26, For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. That is, if his sacrifice was like the Old Testament sacrifices, which were offered continually over and over again. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now in that verse, the word world is used twice. He said Jesus must, if he were like the sacrifices in the Old Testament, he must have suffered often since the foundation of the world. The Greek word that's used for world there is a word that means this physical planet. It's often used in the Bible to mean the earth or this world. It says from the foundation of the world. That's evident from the context that he's talking about. Jesus would have often had to suffer over and over again if he were going to pay for sins like the blood of an animal, like the blood of the sacrifices which are inferior in the Old Testament, since the foundation of this physical world. But then the word is used again, but now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now in our English translation, the word world is used twice. The first time it refers to the planet earth. But the second word is the Greek word aeon, which means a period of time. The first one means a thing or an object, the foundation of the world. But the second one, when it says, He hath appeared in the end of the world to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself, that word is aeon, or the end of the age. Now, when Jesus appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself, that was 2,000 years ago. Could we say that that marked the end of an age, as the writer here says? Once in the end of the age hath He appeared to put away sin. And by the way, that's a good thought we could dwell on for a while. Jesus put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. Usually we tell people in church, you need to put away sin. But really, the reality is Jesus put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. But he says that took place in the end of the age. Well, when Jesus died on the cross, when He said, it is finished, and gave up the ghost, Matthew's Gospel tells us that at that moment the veil of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. He specifies from top to bottom to emphasize the fact that it came from heaven. In other words, God tore the veil of the temple in half. Does that signify anything? Yes, it does. It signifies the end of an Old Testament order of doing things. And the end of the age of the Old Testament, the end of the age of Moses and the prophets, and the beginning of a new age. You know, really, if you want to know the truth, from the time of the death of Jesus until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, exactly 40 years expired, and that was a transitional period. That is the period of time that the Bible writers that we just quoted from were referring to as the last days of the Old Covenant playing out. It was an interim period. It was a transitional period, giving everyone who was under that first covenant at least a full generation to repent and to come out of the Old Covenant and come into the New Covenant, which was ratified by the blood of Jesus. Now, before we comment any further on that, let's just quote this one more time. He hath appeared once in the end of the world, or the end of the age, to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. That's what Jesus did 2,000 years ago. And the writer to the Hebrews says that was in the end of that age. Now keep that in mind. Let's look at another verse that's probably very familiar to you in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24. This is from a passage we call the Olivet Discourse, and we will deal with this more fully in future messages. But for now, let's just look at this same expression about the end of the age or the end of the world. Jesus has just got through having a confrontation with the Pharisees and with the leaders of the temple rulers, and he has left the temple, and he said at the end of chapter 23, Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Notice he didn't call it the temple of God. He said to them upon leaving the temple, your house. He said it's not even God's temple, it's your house. Your house, and now it's left to you desolate. In other words, empty or abandoned. It's a very serious thing that he's saying. Your house is left to you desolate. And so they walked out, and in the beginning of chapter 24, it says, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came to Him for to show Him the buildings of the temple. In other words, I think the disciples were trying to say, Jesus, you know, you're being a little too harsh on them. A little too hard on them by saying, your house is left to you desolate. Have you noticed how great and grand these buildings are? You know, don't be too hasty here, Jesus. Look at how marvelous this temple is. That's what they're saying here. In verse 2, Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Making a prophecy of the casting down and the throwing down and the total destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Upon hearing that in verse 3, the disciples, it said, as He sat down on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of Thy coming? And of the end of the world. There's that expression. Again, it's the Greek word aeon, or the end of the age. Now, all of these things are linked. I know some commentators like to disconnect them, but these are all linked together. What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? And when shall these things be? The throwing down of the temple. All of these things are tied together to a historical fact well attested to in history. And they said, what shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? Well, the word world there is the end of the age. Now, the age that was coming to an end is not the age in which we are living today, but the age in which they were living. I would remind you that Jesus and all of His disciples were Jewish. They were all living under the law. Jesus came to establish a new covenant. But that old age of the law, that old age of animal sacrifice, that old age of a temple in Jerusalem was coming to an end. And Jesus predicted it, and that marks the end of that age.